I often share with you the class that I teach for nurses. And so this week, the nurses were asked to consider a case study wherein a family is told by the doctor that their young son has degenerative kidney disease and will need to go on dialysis. The father, as the case study presents, is a strong Christian, a believer. And so he decides not to take the advice of the doctor, but rather go to his local church and there seek a faith healing for his son. His faith is strong, so he believes God will heal his son, and so that's what he decides to do. Unfortunately, the son is not healed, and so he has to return to the doctor, but in the meantime, the son's health degenerates even more, declines even more, and now the only option available to the son is a full kidney transplant. Fortunately, he has a brother, younger brother, and he is a match, and they can remove the kidney from the one brother's son and give to the other. They're asked to discuss the four basic ethical principles, and I share them with you, and don't worry, I've got a point. We're going in that direction, so just kind of walk along with me, all right? It might sound a little technical, but I think there are some important distinctions that we have to keep in mind as we move to understand these scriptures today. So the first ethical principle that they're asked to consider, and we all know this, we do this very well as Americans. The first ethical principle is autonomy, meaning that we have the freedom to choose, the freedom to decide for ourselves, and that whatever happens in the world, that priority is to be given to my free choice and my own self-determination. In this thing, it says an absence of controlling influences from outside because the controlling interest is only me, that I choose. And so a part of the obligations associated with autonomy is to tell the truth, respect the privacy of others, protect confidential information, and obtain consent for interventions with, in this case, patients or with others. So obtain consent. The next two ethical principles are very close to each other. The next one is called beneficence. And beneficence says, do good always to others. So a part of the idea of beneficence is that it protects and defends the rights of others, so that if you intend to do good for others, you have to protect their rights and, in a sense, defend their right to decide for themselves. That you prevent harm from occurring to others, that you remove the conditions that will cause harm, that you help people with disabilities, and you rescue persons in danger. So that, in other words, if you see driving down the street and you see somebody hit by a car, you don't just drive on, but rather you stop and you offer assistance as best as possible. That's an instance of beneficence. So it's to do good always at all times, regardless of what it might do for you. So again, you're choosing to engage in beneficence. The next ethical value is a principle of non-malfeasance. Now, neither beneficence or non-malfeasance is in our normal course of language, but in any event, it's there. Non-malfeasance basically says, do no harm. So for nurses, this is a priority. Do no harm to the patient. Here's what it involves. It says, don't kill, don't cause pain or suffering to others, don't incapacitate others, and don't cause offense to others. So beneficence and non-malfeasance is do good always and don't bring harm to others. The last principle is the principle of justice. This principle obliges one to equitably distribute benefits, risks, costs, and resources. The following rules always apply. to each person an equal share, to each person according to need. Now listen, to each person according to effort, to each person according to contribution, to each person according to merit. In the discussion, the nurses tend to always put autonomy first, perhaps beneficence or non-malfeasance second, but justice is always last. And I asked them about the difference between if we are going to engage in healthcare, but in our world, if we put autonomy first, meaning the right to choose and the freedom to do so, over beneficence, what is the outcome of that? Compared to if we put beneficence or non-malfeasance first, knowing that whatever we are engaged in, we always do good and that we don't bring harm to others, what is the outcome of that? Most of the time, I don't get them to respond to that. I don't think they understand what I'm asking. But I'm asking to rearrange the priorities. And in fact, in the discussion, they're asked to say, here's the ordering of these ethical principles: autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, justice. But is that how they're ordered in the Christian worldview? And they all come to understand the difference by saying, well, in the Christian worldview, beneficence comes first, non-malfeasance, perhaps justice, and then interestingly, autonomy is last. And I go, wow, that's really interesting, isn't it? That in the world in which we live, we give priority we privilege the exercise of autonomy, but always end up with justice last. I said, what if we put justice first and all the rest were shaped by our view of justice? Again, some of them are willing to take the bait and engage me in discussion about that, and sometimes they're not. I raise this question because the gospel is obviously about not just praying, and I could give you one of those old traditional sermons focused on just pray harder. And I usually, in the class, I usually say, and what happens? Well, what happens to the Father in the case study that I described? When he went with all trust and confidence in God, believing God had the power to heal his son, physically heal his son, what happens to the Father afterwards when his son doesn't get healed? Now, in some instances, the nurses will come back, well, that's just sin in the world caused by Adam and Eve at the beginning means that we're sinful people, that the world is sinful, and that's just how it goes sometimes. And I just don't buy that argument anymore. Sorry, folks. Because then we end up with the statement, because I asked them, I'd say, so what sin did that young son commit to get kidney disease? Because that's what you could end up in the discussion. Well, there's sin in the world, so in a sense, God inflicted this kidney disease. You see how that strange argument goes? Wow, that sounds terrible, that God is a God who inflicts punishment, sending cancer and all kinds of other debilitating diseases and even death simply because God is upset with the sin that we commit. That's a terrible, terrible argument and terrible, terrible view of reality. So I just want to remind you back quite a number of weeks ago where I talked about the Hebrew or Jewish idea of tikkun olam, where the command is to bring a restoration and healing to the world where we restore the brokenness of the world, not talking about sin, but the brokenness of the world. Well, maybe sin might be included in that. But the effort for tikkun olam, the vision and intent of God is to make whole what is broken, whatever that might be, whatever we might be confronted with, that our first and primary goal, it sounds a little bit like beneficence and non-malfeasance. Do good and bring no harm, so that whatever our responses to the world out there, is to bring goodness and not to cause additional harm. And in doing so, what is really what the vision of Tikkun Olam and justice is to restore what is broken in the world. Now, I raised this question, and if Pete was here, I would be outnumbered with Jim and Pete, both who are lawyers, and I don't always mean to make the case about lawyers in the instance. But since justice is a question in the scripture today, I think I'm justified, right, so to speak, in raising the question. Over the past few weeks, as I have listened to the news, I have continually heard the instances in which either the judge or the jury makes a decision regarding a particular crime that has been committed. And when that decision is given at the end, find that outside there are families and people who are demanding justice, as if what happened in the courtroom wasn't justice. And obviously, it seems to me, uneducated in the legal system and law, it seems to me that what they're really asking is, I think of the decision that was brought down in regards to the young man who killed all of those young students in Parkland. And it seems that what, given a life sentence without parole, didn't satisfy any of the parents, and if any of us were in the same situation, it probably wouldn't satisfy us either. But in any event, that was the decision of the court. And if you heard the parents, it sounded to me like what the justice that they wanted was really retribution. In other words, he killed my child, so we need now, which is the legitimate right of the state to put people to death, we need to kill him. And I sat there and I thought, that's really interesting. Remember how I said the difference between putting autonomy and justice in opposite places, and then realizing that in the Christian worldview, that those are reversed, that justice comes first with beneficence and non-malfeasance. It sounds to me that what we demand in this country now in terms of justice if the decision of the judge and the jury doesn't match what I think should be decided, then I will take up the protest, like the woman in the case in the gospel, and start demanding that justice, as I interpret, be imposed. So I did a little research, and again, this is perhaps a little technical, and I'm moving towards a point, all right? So just keep going with me. I think I might have said at that Sunday where we talked about Tikkun Olam, the difference or the contrast between what often is called restorative justice and retributive justice. So I looked up, and it says legally, the term restorative justice is defined as a participatory process wherein all people affected by a particular offense, such as victims, offenders, and community, come together to collectively resolve the situation that follows the aftermath of a crime. The ultimate objectives of restorative justice include victim healing, offender rehabilitation, accountability, victim empowerment, reconciliation, and reparation of the harm caused, community involvement, and resolution of the conflict between all parties concerned. Thus, active participation by all parties is imperative. Active participation of all parties is a part of the key. Retributive justice refers to a theory of justice that is founded on the idea of punishment. Traditionally, it is defined as a theory of justice that views punishment as the best response to crime or the morally acceptable response to crime. However, keep in mind that the emphasis of the theory lies in imposing punishment that is both reasonable and proportionate to the crime in its severity. Maybe that's where the protesters are protesting, that they don't think that it is that the decision was proportionate to what they feel in terms of the heart, the loss, the hurt, and the anger that they feel. Retributive justice has a more moral characteristic in that it seeks to provide mental and or psychological satisfaction and benefits to the victim and the community. Further, retributive justice ensures that such punishment is applied equally to everyone, depending upon the gravity and nature of the crime. And there again might be part of the issue. Is it applied equally, or depending upon the ideology of the given judge, might not be followed out in that way. But notice it says, provide mental and or psychological satisfaction and benefits to the victim. I think I mentioned one time before, Sister Helen Prejean, who has worked with death penalty cases. Her book, A Dead Man Walking, not only became a movie with Sean Penn in it and Susan Sarandon as Sister Helen, but it also then became an opera, surprisingly enough. A world-renowned opera. But what she discovered in interviewing the families of those who were pushing for the death penalty, especially families who had lost sons or daughters to terrible, violent murder or rape, that what she found is that even after the criminal was put to death, that few of them were satisfied, that they still felt hurt, they still felt the loss, they still were angry. So the suggestion that she makes is obviously that this practice of death penalty isn't resolving the brokenness that people experience in their life as a result of violent crime. Okay, I think I've gone too long on that. So in the gospel, this woman, now we don't know what the instance or the circumstances to why the woman is pestering the judge. And it says that she's not getting satisfaction from the judge, and so she pesters him because she wants satisfaction for whatever she believes is the injustice that was committed against her. The judge, on the other hand, skipping a part of it, says, you know, this woman could bring harm to me. And how many instances over the past 5 years have we heard of judges and or other people being murdered by people who didn't feel that justice had been given to them? The judge says, you know, this woman could bring me harm. So notice how it characterized this judge, right? He doesn't really care about God, and he doesn't have respect for people. So the only reason why he now gives justice to the woman is because he fears for his own life, and he just wants her off his back. So I asked the question, notice at the end it says, and this is, so listen to the judge. And then it says that God will give swift justice to those who cry out. Now, in history, we know that there are, like the father in that case study I mentioned at the beginning, lots of people who cry out to God for justice to be given, meaning the removal of the circumstances that is bringing violence and harm to their community and their families, whether it be real violence like we're seeing in Ukraine, or violence that we see against the Uyghurs in China, or the people in Myanmar, the ethnic minorities, whether it's those who cry out. I think back to the situation of the genocide that took place between Rwanda and Burundi, where members of one tribe, who were Christian, by the way, totally slaughtered members of the other tribe who were Christian, by the way, and they cried out for justice. How long do people wait for justice to be given when they cry out not only to the authorities, to the legal system, to wherever? How long do they wait for justice to be given? How long do they wait until they just say, I don't think, God, you pay any attention to me, because you just seem to be giving me the kind of justice that I'm demanding? And there you see the exercise of autonomy, where I think I'm the arbiter of what justice should be. And it doesn't really matter what justice might be for anybody else. And in fact, it doesn't really matter that somebody else gets hurt or somebody else loses their dignity and value while I'm getting my justice. It becomes a challenge, and here's the final part, because the text from Jeremiah is interesting. This particular chapter of Jeremiah actually comes very late. In fact, the Israelites are already in exile. And so in exile, they're probably standing going, what the heck happened? We were faithful, we believed in you. Okay, maybe our kings didn't do justice, meaning they didn't live according to the vision of Torah you had given. In fact, many of us bought into their unjust way of doing things. Many of us had little regard for other human life. Many of us only cared about ourselves. Okay, given all of that, God, how is it that we end up in this place when you said we were your chosen people? And it seemed as if their whole life and their future didn't exist anymore. And so this text in Jeremiah comes. And if you notice, and I mentioned in the Sojourner, at the beginning, when Jeremiah is commissioned as a prophet, God said, remember, Jeremiah didn't want to do this because he knew what he was going to face. And God says, this is what I'm telling you you're going to be as a prophet. You're going to tear down and destroy. You're going to pluck up and end. Because the suggestion, as I gave it previously to this text, the suggestion is that you have to work to dismantle not just an emotional or spiritual world, but you have to dismantle the physical world. Because if the physical world is contributing to the injustice and thereby creating injustice within the person, then you have to tear down and literally start over again, because otherwise, right, you just continue to perpetuate what was bad to begin with. And so if you perpetuate what was bad to begin with, then there isn't much opportunity to create something new that is more in line with the vision of Torah that God has given. And so this text in Jeremiah says, okay, God is saying through Jeremiah, I hear your cries, but I'm still not yet sure that you are as committed as you can be to the vision that I gave you. Because you're still back there, and whenever I hear this, that he says, God says through Jeremiah, you know, when we came out of Egypt, I gave you justice in the commands. But the problem was it was written on stone. And as we see in the great story of Moses in the desert being persuaded by the Israelites to create a golden calf, stones can get broken. I should say Joshua got persuaded, not Moses. Moses was dilly-dallying at the top of the mountain with God. And he comes down and he throws the tablets down. At least Charlton Heston does anyway. And the stone tablets are broken. Then they get remade again and put in the ark, and off they go. No, God says, that's too easy. This is why, side note, why I'm opposed to putting 10 Commandments in courtrooms. Because that just is a paper on the wall. That doesn't mean that this is where I'm going, that the justice executed in that courtroom will follow the vision of God. It just means, isn't that great? Look how Christian you are. We put God first. Anyway, God says through Jeremiah, now this time, it's going to be written on your hearts. And why that? Because in this vision, the heart is not just the beating part that gives life, but the heart is the center and the core of who not only each individual is, but is the center and core of the community. So that if this vision is written on the heart, then it is meant to shape and influence everything else. This is one of the points that I think for the adult conversation about the story, Pat, that you told with Abraham, that when Abraham is asked by God to leave behind everything that he was familiar with, it means that he leaves behind his identity in order to take on a new identity that God is going to give him. So that he has to leave behind connections to family, that he has to leave behind the job that he had, that he has to leave behind the comfort that he had, that he has to leave behind everything that has identified him or defined him in his world in order to go out into that desert and eventually find the world that God intends for him to be in, where he takes on a new identity. That's even said in the story when he moves from Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah, where now the names are given to signify the new identity that he has. And the point of that story, and mixing them all together, is that you see the primary identity we have is that of a Christian, not just following Jesus, but saying that our full identity is shaped by the vision of the reign of God in such a way that the core principles of our life are compassion, mercy, forgiveness, is that steadfastness in love, that unending commitment to be kind even when we are not the recipients of kindness. So that in this sense, justice has to be, that's what the judge was not giving the woman. The judge was not operating out of kindness and generosity and a sense of this woman's dignity. He was not doing that. And that's what makes him unjust. Because in the world of Judaism, he should have been following those 10 commandments. Meaning, he should have been following, if you follow the 10 commandments, right? Honor your ancestors. Don't violate life by killing others. Honor and respect your neighbor's goods. Those are pretty solid, ethical, justice issues, aren't they? Honor your ancestors. Don't take anybody else's life. Sounds like non-malfeasance. Honor your ancestors. Sounds like beneficence. And don't steal or take your neighbor's goods. There's justice. At the top is the vision of God. God, remember how it is, slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. If that's who God reveals God's self to Moses, then you see the practice and exercise of justice has to be the same way. That's why, in my opinion, restorative justice is the only kind of justice that we should be committed to. Because it takes both victim and the one who perpetrated the crime
Think of what happened in South Africa. If you don't know that story, look it up. That Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, who had been the victim of the unjust apartheid system, and Desmond Tutu on top of it, that they realized that if they came out of apartheid wanting to kill the perpetrators of the violence done to them, then the whole world would end. And both of them said, we have to be committed to restorative justice, to bring the parties together, let them yell and scream at each other till they get it all out, and then sit down and say, where do we go from here? How do we go forward? How do we bring about the healing of the earth? How do we go about bringing the healing from the broken relationships that we have? I think that's what these texts are about. What's placed in our heart is slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love, so that the choices and decisions we make in reference to autonomy are never decisions and choices that bring harm to others or do nothing but violence towards others. That's the kind of justice that the reign of God and the vision of these scriptures presents us with.